This is the fifth and last segment of the participation sociology series. I said you have to do it properly, which is deep cover over a long period, not telling anybody what you're doing and doing it as a full participant. But you have to do more than that. Sometimes you need to really stretch the boundaries. Now take Donald Roy, I mentioned, the great observer. He worked in factories, did some wonderful sympathetic studies of men on piecework, apart from his gem of an article on banana time. He went to Duke University in North Carolina. Funnily enough, he got in there and got tenure before they realised he was on the side of the working stiff, as he used to call them, not of the bosses. But anyway, he took part in union organising campaigns to see what they were like. And he took part on the side of the workers. And one day he said he was caught in what was a riot on his side of the barricades, where he was, with the other men. They started throwing rocks. And Don was in an immediate quandary. What shall I do, he said. If I don't do anything, I'm going to stick out like a sore thumb. And if I throw rocks, I might actually hurt someone. What did he do? Pretended. He bent down, picked up imaginary rocks, and threw them with all his force that he could, so as not to become exposed, either as an onlooker or as a participant doing his job. I'll take the wonderful John Griffin, who in 1961, because John already allegedly had the bone and hair structure very similar to that of the American Negro, he blacked up. He was a white man who blacked up, darkened his skin, dyed his hair, did it all under professional help, and went to live as a black man in the deep South in America in 1961. That's one way of stretching the boundaries. Another way, the great Jonathan Rubinstein's book, City Police. Jonathan joined the Philadelphia police force and was armed throughout his period of participation with a .38 revolver. Killing those he was participating with was an obvious option he had to consider. He was trained to use a gun, and he said to me only the other day when I asked him this, we've been friends for nearly 20, 30 years, that had he had to have gone ever to the assistance of his buddy, he would have drawn his gun and used it under those circumstances. Killing your respondents, then, is perhaps the rather extreme way of pushing the boundaries, but it shows you what can be done and what should be done. Irving Goffman once said, what a secret tape that was made during a presentation he was giving at some conference or whatever. Irving says at one point, all right, turn all the tape recorders off, and you hear a number of clicks, except of course the click of the recorder that this was taped on. One of the things he said was, field work takes a minimum of 1 year. 1 year minimum field work as a deep participant in the sociological quest for meaning and understanding. He also said, classic Goffman throwaway line, there's only two sorts of people that do participant work like this. There's the police and there's us. He said, and the only difference is the police are better at it than we are. Perhaps because they do it all the time. Perhaps because they all had to do it. Maybe that's why they're so much better. There's a lesson there. What are you trying to find out? What are you trying to participate in? What are you trying to get at with participation studies? Well, people don't experience their lives, however bizarre they may seem to us, don't experience their lives as being extraordinary or unusual. They experience them as being usual, common, unextraordinary. That's where you have to find. That's what you have to discover. The best way of encapsulating this, perhaps, or the neatest way I ever came across, was an article written by the psychiatrist Ronnie Lang in the 1960s. It was simply called The Obvious. And it starts, if I remember correctly, with him saying something of a shock. Only 25% of the American population in 1967, I think it was, realised that China had a communist government. More important than that, for the rest of them, it was obvious that they didn't. It's getting at the obvious that often beleaguers the search for meaning, genuine meaning. I'll give you another example. It comes from a documentary I saw. I must have seen it 30 years ago. I don't have a copy, but I remember it very well. It was about a tribe of pygmies in Africa. Beautifully made documentary, actually. The best bit, though, actually, was that the tribe had been researched before, way back before the First World War, where the researcher then had the foresight to take one of the early cine cameras with him. And the TV documentary used some of the original footage to show what this pygmy tribe was like 50 years ago. Bits of it showed the original researcher himself, attired in full district commissioner uniform with his boots and his puttees, his long trousers right up to his pith helmet, which is how anthropologists who founded ethnography, let us not forget, used to dress. The other good bit was that the modern documentary makers had found one of the pygmies who had, as a young man, been in the original film. He was now a toothless old man, but he told this story. We were all puzzled, he said. Whenever we wanted to have a crap, they wore just the equivalent of a tea towel back and front. We just used to squat down wherever we were and do it, but we never saw him do it. We didn't like to ask him outright. So we thought about it for a while, and then we realised what the puttees and the long trousers for. They were to hold the crap in before he had the time and opportunity to empty them. To check this, he said, many years ago, we used to follow him at night. He wandered off every night at exactly the same time. About 100 yards away, took the trousers and puttees off, and then a little later on, got busy with his spade. We used to wait till he returned to the camp, and then try to dig up what he'd buried, but we never found anything. The TV asked him why. Because, he said, and he grinned his toothless grin again, we thought it would be white. The chap's skin was white, so they naturally assumed, well, you can finish off the sentence, that would be white as well. It was so obvious to them, they never thought to ask the question. Let me give you another example. Again, not from a piece of, strictly speaking, participant work. It happened in a drug recovery project, and I was interviewing some junkies just on an intake sheet I was designing for the local council. One of the questions was an attempt to find out what they did for a living, or rather how they got their money. In fact, on the checklist of items, possible answers to the question, where do you get your money from, job wasn't even mentioned. In Possil in Glasgow in the 1980s, it was never mentioned. It was all answers like benefits, dole money, burglary, prostitution. And we asked this one guy, I was working with a young researcher there, who was working his way through community college in order to get to university to get a degree, which he did eventually. We asked this chap, or rather he asked this chap, and this is one of the benefits of jotting down things, even when you're asking positivist type questions, jotting down anything that people say, because it gets more revealing than any amount of quantitative information. We asked him where he got his money from, and he said, "I'm a forger." Both our ears pricked up, both our four ears picked up at this. We hadn't come across a forger before, so the young man I was with, Sam, said, "What do you forge?" And he said, "Oh, well, you know, this time of year, A-level certificates, higher certificates, education certificates, driving licenses, passports, they're all run-of-the-mill, you know, we do that all the time." Well, we were stunned, you know, we sat back, and Sam, who I say was working towards getting into university to do a degree in computing studies, which he did, well, computing science, which he did, said, "What else do you do?" And the chap said, "Well, you name it, son, I'll do it for you." So Sam said, "Well, could you do a degree certificate?" He said, Aye, son, I could do a degree certificate." So Sam then said, "Well, could you do one in like computing science, not computing studies, because as if it were like harder to forge a qualification for the hardest subject." The guy said, Aye, son, I'll have it with you Thursday, all right?" And turned and he walked to the door, and as he opened the door, he half went out, and he turned back and said to us, "By the way," he said, "what's a degree?" It was so obvious to us what a degree was. It never occurred to us to mention to him what it was. He didn't know, we didn't know, he didn't know. It was obvious to us, but not to him. So if you like the idea, as some do, that participation sociology is about producing a recipe for doing whatever the group is doing, or members of the group is doing, and that would be an adequate test to the validity and adequacy of the analysis itself. You have to do what you might call an everyman performance. You might treat all interactions as everyman performances. What are their ordinary expectations and understandings? You have to cite, this I reminded of Everett Hughes' wonderful article, Good People and Dirty Work, where he tries to explain why good Germans during the Second World War did the dirty work for the Nazis. How could good Germans do this? Most of the German population being good. Hughes said the key is to really be able to depict sufficient number of conditions for a reasonable man to consider what they did to be a rational performance. In other words, you have to display the circumstances under which good people do bad things, and it strikes them as the thing to do. Participation studies are sometimes erroneously criticised as being only about the powerful. Now, it's important to use whatever contacts you have to get into a field, whatever field. And I've seen many students get into the field because they happen to do X or happen to do Z, happen to do Y. One woman, it only materialised several weeks into her graduate study that she was a very senior member of the Salvation Army. So I switched her away from, she wanted to study Bergeron and Luckman's reality, something or other. So, in other words, an armchair piece of work. So I switched her into studying, albeit not as a participant, because she already was one, studying the Salvation Army. And it was a fascinating piece of work. She was able to, did you know, for example, that there used to be a Salvation Navy as well as a Salvation Army? And that most of their budget collected on behalf of the poor and injured actually goes on their media campaigns to raise more money, as is true perhaps of many charities. We actually managed to arrange an interview with the founder, Booth's granddaughter, I think it was, Catherine Booth, and June, the woman who was doing this. successfully managed to interview her just a few weeks before she died. This is another feature of participation. Participation is the most efficient way of discovering what questions to ask. Because they can't lie to you, because they know you do it. Whatever it is they do, you've done it. They can't lie to you. They can't get away with it, and they know that. Once you've got what you want, you've got your questions, sit them down with a tape recorder and this is the most efficient way of getting the sort of bulk quotation material that you need to illustrate the model that you will eventually lay out in front of your reader. Specifically, I said, you go out there and you write it all down. Now, I had one student who, it turned out, when I probed his biography a little more carefully, that he was living with what was referred to in the late 1980s as an away day prostitute. She worked, I think, Leeds every other weekend, and she came out to Glasgow to see my young student and ply her trade on the alternative weekends. And he lived with her very amiably and very happily, and he knew all her friends who were also on the game. So he said, what do I do? I said, well, just write everything down. You know them all. If you suck for something to do, give some framework to your notes. So write down because they used to sit in a little coffee bar near Central Station in Glasgow. The girls used to come in after an hour or half an hour's work on the corner and sit down and take their boots off, their high heels, wrap up warm, have a nice cup of tea before going out again. So he would question them. How many clients? How much did you charge? Were they good? Was it bad? How long did you spend on the corner? Was tonight any different? And with that imagination, he marked all this on the map with the names of the working girls. One day, as he himself was coming out of Central Station, the coffee bar near Central Station, he was accosted by 3 mildly drunk German tourists, males, who said to him, "Where are the girls in this city?" So the chap in question immediately put his hand in his pocket and produced a detailed and annotated map showing every girl, the time they worked, what they charged, what they did, and the geographical location of the corner they worked. The 3 German tourists, I think, were suitably very impressed. So you write it all down. You have to give your notes some sort of structure. How do you analyse this stuff? You've got masses of notes. Well, you really analyse it as you go along. I used to come home from 12, 13-hour shifts on the bakery, sometimes around 6:37 in the morning, sometimes around 6:37 at night, depending on which shift I was in. I would immediately go and sit quietly in the kitchen, fulfilling what at that night and every other night had become a great dream, which is to have a bowl of cornflakes with icy cold milk to replace and nullify the effects of working on the ovens all night. So you have to give your notes some sort of structure, and you have to make your notes conform to this structure, or rather a loose and probably irrelevant structure to start with. I used to just note down every break I had, the time of every break, because we used to get on the ovens a 5-minute break, a smoke break every hour, and every 3 hours I think we got 1/4 of an hour, and then in the middle of the shift we got half an hour for lunch, whatever time of the day or night it was. You analyse as you go along, and you code little segments and snatches of speech that you've remembered, or in my case I had hidden on a little notepad in the sewn-in pocket on my overalls that I did for that very purpose, because having started writing notes on Bronco, hard, lavatory paper, I found with the sweat of the ovens in my body, these would self-erase before I got home. I noticed on one occasion, a trivial occasion, that Ben, one of the workers on the big ovens, always seemed to stand rather awkwardly. I couldn't figure out why he stood at a rather awkward angle. Then I realised didn't want to see the clock. He didn't want to see the time passing slowly. So I initially coded that as avoiding time and began to look for other instances of avoiding time. Something else, though, happened a few nights later. One of the cake makers walked past me as I was shoveling trays of crusty rolls out of the small conveyor belt oven, nodded to the clock and said, and I quote, "Sometimes seems like some buggers standing on the hands of the clock and stopping them going round." I call that managing time, just for the want of anything else to call it, with a subcategorization as confrontation. And I went back to Ben's original example of standing where he couldn't see the clock and renamed it managing time, but then subclassified it as avoidance. So you build up this scaffold on which you hang the quotations and the observations that you make as a participant. So I had one general category, managing time, with two subcategories. That's how you build up your note bank and how you begin to analyze them. The rest of it falls into place by following the fairly simple precepts in The Discovery of Grounded Theory by Glaser and Strauss, which they've rewritten several times, but the original book is probably the best source. Ultimately, this is where I nearly am. Ultimately, I didn't refer to the problem of looking at the powerless or looking at the powerful. It can be done. Take a couple of recent examples. First of all, get the example of, now I've lost the note, I'll have to look for it briefly before I can continue. Get the example of two wonderful studies, one done in France on the French Stock Exchange. If you like, a qualitative investigation of the well-known hedge fund quants, as they're called. One was carried out in America by Karen Ho, called Liquidated. It was about the Great Crash, 2008. She worked at Bankers Trust for a period between 1996 and 1999 to study the sociological relationships that worked and ended up being a far more coherent and better explanation of the reasons for the crash than any of the usual macro analyses, such as lack of regulation, that are trotted out, with presumably the rider that increased regulation will not solve the problem. Or you can look at the example of Vincent Lepine, a Frenchman who worked on the Paris Bourse and worked on Codes of Finance, is the title of his book, Codes of Finance, where he did the same thing with the French Stock Exchange. Looked at the sociological networks and relationships that pretty much guaranteed this sort of sporadic boom and bust, whereas there are some intrinsic features of capitalist economics that explain the cycle, but he fills in all the ground detail by participating as a banker. Finally, and this refers to all studies done on a particular participant framework of understanding and development of meaning, the real test of whether you got into a fieldwork setting is, can you get out? Almost paraphrasing Blake, who once said, "You never know when you've had enough until you've had too much. You never know you've done enough participant work until they beg you to stay rather than go." This is how I left the bakery. The bakery was in the southern part of England, near where I was born and brought up. My university was in Durham in the north. I had to travel 350 miles on a permanent basis to stop the endless phone calls, begging me to come in to do another shift or to fill in for someone who was on holiday. Not begging me to come back as an observer, a participant, because they didn't know about it. But begged me to come back as a worker, which is a testament, I think, to the success of undercover participation. That's the end of the series. Participation.